Well, here this evening. It's early morning where Phil Bekker is in the United States, and it's late in the evening here where I am in the Philippines. But Phil was a corporal in the Air Force, um, but not. He wasn't a real Air Force blue job guy because he drove around in armored cars, protecting Air Force assets. And Phil and I both come from Umtali, and I'd just like you to give us. Phil's come up with a really, really interesting, a beautiful slideshow that I first saw in the form of a PowerPoint presentation, but the most high quality Rhodesian army pictures I've ever seen, actually. And so it's going to be a real treat, I think, for the blue jobs to have a look at these pictures of some of their stomping ground, you know. But Phil, will you just give us a little introduction to
Sure.
yourself and what we've got here today?
Great. Hey, John. Thanks very much for those kind words, and really appreciate you including me in your series. It's a great honor. Um, I'll start right at the beginning. I was born in Umtali in 1952. Um, we lived on a farm outside Umtali, close to Old Umtali, and off the road to Inyanga. So it wasn't too far, but it was well out of town. Um, I was a boarder in kindergarten at a private residence, and then went to boarding school um, in Chancellor Junior School, and then at the beginning of high school, my father died when I was 16, so we moved into Umtali, and that put the end to farm life. Um, Obviously, national service came soon after that, and I was fortunate enough to get into the Air Force. Um, we started November 1972, and obviously all training at New Serum and Como range was sort of basic training, and only lasted until kind of towards the end of December. The end of December, we were kind of promised Christmas off, but the same day they called us in and said, "Listen, we've got intel that there possibly going to be attacks on the forward airfields, so we're going to ship you guys to the three forward airfields." So they selected 12 for each FAF, 1, 2, and 3. FAF is meaning forward airfield, um, and 2 armored cars per group. So we drove the next morning from New Serum to Thornhill Air Base, and then from Thornhill Air Base we went on a low loader, 2 low loaders obviously, to Wankie. Got there at about midnight, and the next morning found out that already a company of RAR, Rhodesian African Rifles, was camped in the bush at the end of the runway. So that was like a bit eye-opening. Within a day or two, we were all asked to, excuse me, do our last will and testament. Um, so we realized things could be serious, but fortunately nothing came of that, so that was quite good. Um, our job primarily was, they told us you have to drive up and down on the runway and detonate any landmines that have been planted there. The people just told that the vehicles are too heavy, and there was no way we were going to drive on the tarmac or the asphalt. So we did a bit of driving on the edges, but that kind of petered out, and we eventually didn't do that much with the armored cars. We went to the range a few times and did some sort of trips into the outside areas of Wankie, but otherwise they weren't a huge part of our lives. And which reminds me, I was actually more in helicopters than armored cars, and I would say 10 times more time spent in helicopters than in armored cars. And I love those Alouettes, and I would beg, steal, and borrow to fly whenever I can, or whenever I could, rather, and either fly shotgun or just go for the ride. Um, I'd gone into the Air Force with a camera, just a basic Leica mat, and a couple of lenses, no zooms or anything fancy, and really enjoyed just like taking happy snaps, basically. Never had any problems except that in Como, when one of the officers wanted to know what was going on, and we just said it was going to be for a manual, and he seemed happy with that. in Wankie at FAF1, we had South African Air Force, really called SAP, but they weren't SAP, and Rhodesian aircrew. They were swapped like every 2 weeks. So they would come in with new helicopters and new fixed wing. And the fixed wing were mostly Trojans and Cessnas. And the occasional Provost came in. And in fact, you'll see a picture of Brian Barber getting a lift home from a cricket test in a Provost from Bulawayo. Talking about Brian, I had been in touch with the station warrant officer, John Cox, on and off for years. And about a year and a half ago, he sent me an email, because I'd gotten off Facebook by then, and just wanted to know how I was doing, and I inquired about him, and he said things weren't so good. Anyway, then I sort of got onto Fighting Men in Rhodesia on YouTube, and I watched one of the episodes of an Air Force guy, I can't remember his name, but he was with Cox, who had gone from station warrant officer and sergeant to wing commander, and he was supposedly involved in that sabotage at Thornhill Air Base. Anyway, from that episode on Fighting Men in Rhodesia, I found out that John had actually died, which was a huge shock. And then I also found out through his daughter that WO1 Ken Salter had also died in the UK. And that was, again, like now there are two of them. And then not long after that, Brian Barber's girlfriend from 1972-73 got hold of me and said that Brian had died, and could I send her some photographs of him, which of course I had some negs. So I got to thinking, well, like, there's so many people dying. And in fact, recently I found out that a third of the team that went to Wankie had already died as well. So I thought it was time to do something and get involved. So I spoke to Fighting Men in Rhodesia, and they said, listen, you have to print a book before you die. So I thought, well, I think YouTube might have better longevity than some book. So I started looking for negatives, which took forever, and I still haven't found some of them. And then it took 4 months to work on the images in this presentation. And some of the images took 2 to 3 days to retouch each, because they had gotten damaged and I had flood damage downstairs. So it was quite a task. But I think there's enough there to give one a good idea of what went on. So basically, I think this presentation will appeal to people who did their national training in the Rhodesian Air Force, especially if it was involved with armored cars. Also, the Army also had armored cars, but obviously the bigger ones with the 90s, and we had the 60mm mortar. So they might find that interesting. And anybody who was involved with Wankie Forward Airfield, crews who went there on a rotational basis, people who just flew in there, people who did their military service there. And at that time, at the beginning of '73, it was quite basic, really. There was no protection for the aircraft. I mean, we had a couple of armored cars, but if somebody really wanted to get in there and take them all out, they could have done that probably fairly easy. So it'll be interesting on that point of view. Yeah. So let's have a look and see what you think. Thanks very much again, John. Appreciate all your help and patience, and I hope you guys like it. Thank you.